Assalamu alaikum, welcome to Face the Facts on my channel. I'm your host Adnan Khan. This is a brand new format and a brand new show, and it is going to primarily focus on issues surrounding British Muslims and Muslims within Britain and their lot, the various things that may affect their day-to-day lives. As we confirmed and finalized the format and the date and time for the show last week, it was apt that in that same week, last Monday, the Prime Minister David Cameron visited a school in Birmingham where he made a speech outlining what is to be the government's policy on tackling extremism over the next 5 years. The introduction of new terminologies such as nonviolent extremism, to point to the most significant and chief of those, has riled up many of the commentators and thinkers, academics, people who've spoken out about it. That is going to be the primary focus, both the speech and some of the language used within it, and the broader policy of this government. With me to discuss the subject is, first of all, the Chairman of the Conservative Muslim Forum, Mohammed Amin. Welcome to the show, sir.
Good evening.
And the second guest, Brother Sharif Hafizi, who's a speaker, writer, activist. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me. Jazakallah khair.
So right off the bat, as it were, let's begin by addressing this issue, this idea which was outlined in the week preceding the speech to meet the press in America by David Cameron, and then the speech focused primarily upon it, the idea of non-violent extremism. How do we define what is non-violent extremism?
Well, first of all, the concept of non-violent extremism is not new. It's something that David Cameron has mentioned on many occasions before, most notably in his Munich speech in 2011, and then again earlier this year when he made a speech in Bratislava. But this is the first time he's devoted an entire speech to this one subject, and done that in the UK and in front of a largely Muslim audience. To understand non-violent extremism, first of all, let's see if we can agree on what violent extremism is. Violent extremism is when people commit acts of terrorism or try to commit acts of terrorism, and part of their motivation is an ideology which David Cameron calls violent Islamist extremism. Now, I personally don't like the word Islamist very much.
Sorry to interrupt it quite early on here, but we began by speaking about what violent extremism is. We can bring in this other terminology of Islamism and ideology, etc. But violent extremism will be pretty clear cut in that it's
people who want to commit violence.
Yes.
So
non-violent extremism is a little bit more problematic. That's why I want to try
a non-violent extremist is a person who believes basically the same things that violent extremists believe, but does not personally engage in violence and is not personally trying to commit violence, even though he may approve of it. A non-violent extremist is somebody who believes basically the same things that violent extremists believe, except does not get involved directly in violence.
But is that not problematic? And that's something that's very important in this conversation and this discussion, that if you are going to say that people who believe in the same things as those who then commit violence, those people ought to be criminalized, is that not quite a problematic way to try and set up a discussion or try and set up legislation or the mindset of a nation?
David Cameron has never said that people who are non-violent extremists are going to be criminalized. What he has said is that these are not people that we approve of. They are not people who are going to get any kind of government support. They're not going to get dialogue with the government, and we want to marginalize them. He has never talked about criminalizing them.
Right. But see, I don't want to delve into this too early on, but a lot of people may take issue with whether that is being criminalized. But I will come back to that as an issue. Non-violent extremism, in essence, a definition being offered by Mohammed Amin here, that people who believe in essentially the same things as those who carry out acts of violent extremism, but who do not, what differs between the two is the carrying out of the actus reus of the act. Is that a succinct enough definition?
I think this is the key problem, and I'll show you the examples of why this is a problem. Let's take, for example, Tony Blair. Tony Blair, in the early 2000s, he talked about this idea of liberal interventionism. This idea that violence, and actually preemptive violence, meaning invading another country, even though it's not a defensive war, is legitimized because of some sort of human rights or liberal abuses that are taking place. So he was arguing for violence in this situation. So the argument therefore would be, well, okay, if a person believes in liberalism, but may not believe in Tony Blair's doctrine of liberal interventionism, he's an extremist as well. And therefore maybe he should be excluded from civil society, maybe he should be prevented from speaking at universities, maybe he should have control orders being placed upon him because he believes in liberalism. Similarly, I could talk about animal rights terrorists or extremists, people who go around blowing up or attacking people involved in vivisection, which is testing on animals. We could then turn around and say, well, okay, the problem is animal rights. We need to get rid of animal rights.
Because from that same group of people arise a few who then commit these acts of terror.
And even further than this, people like, the Richard Dawkins, he even says, well, actually the real problem is people believing in religion. Let's just get rid of religion itself. You see how the argument of somebody commits a criminal act and then the argument of, okay, let's ban those associated ideas that perhaps we don't like. Those two things become conflated to such an extent that effectively you create a totalitarian type of society, almost, control people's ideas and behavior in the name of supposedly liberalism and secularism.
Is that not a deeply worrying and concerning position? We spoke of, you make the point that these people are not being criminalized. Allow me to rephrase that. Let me use a different term. The ostracizing of people, the placing of ASBOs upon people on what they can and cannot say in the public sphere. The banning of certain speakers from universities, the places where free thinking is supposed to take its root, the placing of restrictions upon venues from hiring out to certain groups or people who operate within the law. That's very important to remember here. Are all of these not measures which run counter to the narrative of being a free thinking, freedom of speech society? Is that not ironically contradictory?
Well, first of all, the precise details of what the government is actually going to do have not yet been published, and the government's views have been evolving over time. It's very clear that there is a problem. We want to deal with that problem while preserving the freedoms, including freedom of speech, that all of us value. So, for example, David Cameron condemned people who believe in the world Jewish conspiracy, but we do not make it illegal to buy and sell the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. In fact, last week, just to make a point, I went and bought a copy of that from Amazon for 99p. But that does not mean that if you believe in the world Jewish conspiracy, you're fit to be a school head teacher or any kind of teacher at school or a trustee of a charity. We do want to marginalize people who believe certain kinds of things like that to stop them influencing other people.
Well, allow me to ask you a very forthright question then. One of the things that one of the charges leveled against people from all religious, but especially from the Abrahamic religious faiths, is one of homophobia. We were discussing before the show, and you mentioned that you are upon the advisory council where the three faiths
forum
collaboration. A lot of interfaith work you're involved in. Now, the strictest interpretations of all three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, make homosexuality a sin. For Muslims to express that in public, that homosexuality is a sin, is seen as extremist speech by the media, by a lot of people who will comment upon these so-called homophobic remarks. And that then puts you in that category of being a non-violent extremist because you hold these views.
Not in the slightest. I have no hesitation whatsoever in saying that I believe that homosexuality is a sin. People who are homosexuals face a difficult issue with God on the Day of Judgment. They'll have to throw themselves on His mercy. We don't know how He will deal with them, but it is quite clearly a sin, something that God has said is wrong. That is my view.
Absolutely. But
I have no fear saying that.
But you as an individual, fine.
Yeah.
But do you accept that there is a societal backlash against, for example, I can specifically name Mufti Menk from South Africa, who had a lot of the media saying that this individual should be banned from speaking at universities and venues because he has made this kind of homophobic remarks. Can you see the problem with trying to ostracize people while saying we're not criminalizing them?
Not in the slightest. I have no hesitation in saying this on live TV. I do not expect to be ostracized by the government. The dividing line comes when you go from saying that it's a sin to saying that people who are homosexuals should be killed, that they should be discriminated against, that they should not be employed. It is when you turn from believing that something is a sin to wanting to punish people who are homosexuals, that's when you cross the line.
Well, okay, let me extend that same point then. One of the other key things mentioned by David Cameron in the discourse that surrounded this speech was those who do not believe in Israel's right to exist, amongst the Muslims specifically. Can you see how that might be problematic for a lot of Muslims if that is going to make you a non-violent extremist? And that's the exact same question that I will come to you with, sir.
Yeah, can I also mention this point about homosexuality? What Muhammad Amin has said is that people shouldn't be ostracized. Is that what you're saying? That if they say it's a sin, they should still be allowed to go and speak at universities, even if they're public in their criticism and condemnation of that sin? Is that what you're saying? Is that's okay to do?
Depends on what you mean by public in condemnation of the sin. I have said quite clearly my religious belief that it is a sin. I'm saying it in public. I've said it before in writing, in public.
With a lot of Muslim speakers, they want to go to university, or they may want to talk about how it's haram, it's wrong. People, Muslims and non-Muslims, shouldn't be engaged in it. We're not talking about the punishment aspect of this, because obviously we live in Britain. Nobody's looking to implement this, extrajudiciary. This is not from an Islamic perspective anyway. But in terms of specifically, saying publicly, actually, I think it's a right for Muslims to go out in the public sphere, whether it is at university, in colleges, in community centres, and saying it is wrong, you should not be a homosexual, you should not engage in this activity because it is sinful.
I will take your answer on that, but let me take a call in. Muhammad Bilal from Stoke-on-Trent.
Hello, Sadian.
Wa alaikum assalam, yes sir.
Yeah, basically, I've got a question. Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, this seems to be a bit out of sync, you guys.
Could you put down the volume of your TV because it's mixing with your voice?
Yeah, basically, okay, I've got a question from one of my cousins. He wanted to ask. He wanted me to ask. Basically, he didn't want to ask himself.
Okay.
He says basically he's quite concerned with regards to kids being taught homosexuality at school, and the fact that kids, never mind about homosexuality, shouldn't even be exposed to any kind of sexual education, according to his belief at that age, at the age of 5-6 years old. So what practical steps can Muslims actually take towards this? I know it might be a bit off topic, but I was asked this question by someone else to ask.
Thank you very much for your contribution. I'll try and incorporate that within the discussion, and that was something that we were going to come on to, but I'll allow you to...
So can I just to point out as well, is that this discussion about homosexuality is a sin, and being able to express it openly is something that in 2009 there was a leaked document called Contest 2 that was leaked to the Guardian newspaper. And in one of the key aspects of this leaked document that was commissioned by the Labour government at the time, which has been carried on by the Prevent strategy with the Conservatives, they said this, which is one of the key aspects. They argue that Islam bans homosexuality and that it is a sin against Allah. That if you consider that, then you are part of this extremism, you are on a conveyor belt, you are in a process of becoming a radical and a process of becoming a terrorist. And this feeds in now to how prevents being implemented in schools, which I think touches upon what has been mentioned. There were, inspectors from Ofsted that went into schools to see if they were being radicalized in schools, and they were asking questions to children as young as 5 and 6, predominantly a Islamic faith-based school. What's your view of homosexuality? Have you been taught lesbianism? What's your view about, is it good or is it bad? And this is what's being asked. And based upon their answers, some of these individuals are being referred to channel program. Some of these schools are then being considered radicalized schools that therefore the governors have to be sacked from, or they have to change. In fact, there's even one school in Manchester, a Muslim school, that was so scared that they actually tried to go so further in terms of teaching homosexuality that they were, bringing the 15-year-olds to teach 10, 11-year-olds or 11-year-olds about lesbianism or a girls' school, a Muslim girls' school. And the reason why they were doing that was because they were scared about Ofsted inspectors and about the demonization and about the fact that they will be labeled extremists, they will be removed, or the school will be closed down, or they'll be put on channel programs for the
Let me restate the question from that obviously, which is, do you believe that within a society that openly, prides itself upon the idea of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, people ought to be able to say, my religion says that homosexuality is a sin and nobody should be engaged within it, and they do not feel any public backlash from public bodies or universities or institutions of this nature? People may find their views odious, that's people's right, but universities will not ban them from speaking there because they are seen as homophobes. Are we saying this because that is a well-established part of the PREVENT programme, which has been, which was instituted under Labour and has been strengthened and has gone further under the Conservatives?
The people who have been called extremists are not people who are simply saying that they believe that homosexuality is wrong and that people shouldn't do it. They're people who go much further than that. They call, the normal terminology they used to avoid getting into too much trouble is they say in an ideal Islamic state, these people will be put to death.
But aren't they allowed to say that?
That is a code word for saying really that homosexuals should be discriminated against, that they should be killed if they could change the laws.
There's legislation in this country that prevents prejudice and that prevents biased decisions, etc., by government bodies, employers, etc. That's all well and true. But a lot of people will hold a theological view, a religious view, that first of all, that there ought to be an Islamic state, an ideal Islamic state, and within that state, the laws of Islam basically institute this punishment for this act done in a certain context with a certain number of witnesses in public, etc.
What I would say is this, I'd say that's even taking it too further, because you like the example of Mufti Menk. What you find is that he was prohibited going to university to give lectures because of a talk that he gave in Zimbabwe maybe 5, 6, maybe 10 years ago, or however many years ago it was, that it was taken up and then it was shown and saying, look, this guy is, and they use the term homophobic, and took his speeches and various points that he said out of context, and he was prevented from doing that. But that's the problem that we have. He wasn't advocating them to be killed. He wasn't advocating the implementation of Sharia law.
But my idea would still be this, that even people who speak, because it's still theory, that's the distinguishing bit here, that's the part that I'm trying to make a distinction between. These people are not killing or calling on their followers to kill people. What they are saying is a theoretical position. Should people be able to express theological and theoretical positions from their religious belief without feeling like they are being targeted by the government, by the society, by the general populace? And that is done through the government and through various bodies, through the media, through institutions.
When people say, we want to set up an ideal Islamic state, and in such an ideal Islamic state homosexuals will be killed, they have gone to the wrong side of the line.
Fair enough, and you're allowed to think this. However, should people be able to express this view that an Islamic state would institute Islamic punishments, and the Islamic punishment for homosexuality, which is evidenced, is death? Should people be allowed to say that Islam says this, or is that a view that we're going to trample upon?
They're not going to be locked up for saying it, but it's quite clear that if they do say that, they will be amongst the goats rather than the sheep. Because that is a dividing line.
We've focused on, the fine line becomes blurry, and it will become clear from the discussion as we go along. When we are asking, and this is one of the things that Prevent has instituted and will go further with the Counterterrorism and Securities Act. When we are asking teachers, doctors, nurses, other professionals to, in essence, we can use terminology that softens the blow, but in essence spy upon or provide information upon those people who are in their care, in their trust, in their guidance, as to if they feel that there are markers for these people becoming radicalized. When we are asking primary school teachers to provide this sort of information on children, is that not the hallmark of a police state?
On the contrary, the channel program exists to protect and help these young people, because there is nothing worse than having a young child who's radicalized and ends up going off to Syria.
But
this is not spying on them, this is helping them.
This is a bit of a problematic issue, because Syria has existed for the whole of 5 years, despite all the death and destruction. But the Prevent program, which is, for example, been made part of legislation now, it's far older. It was a recommended position before, and now it's a government position that's enforced by legislation. However, it was there before Syria happened. So Syria happens to be just a convenient part of narrative, doesn't it?
Let me take another example. The youngest of the 7/7 bombers, who I think was about age 18, Sir Norman Bettison, when he was giving evidence before the House of Commons Home Affairs Select Committee, and you can find this on the internet, there's a direct quote of his, he talks about how there were signs with this young chap, I can't remember his name, Muhammad Asib, I think, and when you read his school notebooks and so on, there were troubling thoughts. Nobody actually helped him. The purpose of the channel program is to actually help people like that, to stop them ending up as suicide bombers.
This is, again, problematic. Sharif, I promised, I know this is the second or third rally, but I will come to you. But this is problematic because some of the things that we are pointing towards when we say that there were signs of radicalization will exist in a wide sample of people amongst the Muslim youth, and 99.9999 recurring percent will never turn to violent extremism, because these signs do not give us a marker of who is about to commit violent acts of terrorism. They are not a guide, because they will lead you to too many people, they will lead us to suspect too many people, they will further add to the Islamophobia, and that is what a lot of people are arguing.
Well, first of all, the channel program is not about suspecting people, it's about helping them. And clearly, we don't want every child in the country going through the channel program, because it becomes self-defeating and it's a massive waste of resources.
But we want a program who is a 3-year-old. Yeah. 3-year-old 2 days ago. What signs of radicalization are you seeing in a nursery child?
It sounds to me that somebody was overly enthusiastic in interpreting the channel program.
And that's that's the door that we have left open.
But remember, the channel program is about helping people, it's not about spying on them.
But is what Mr. Amin is saying, is that merely language? Is it just juggling with words that it's about helping people?
Yeah, what you've got now is you've got a statutory requirement that all public bodies, such as schools, such as universities, such as hospitals, such as GPs, and even nursery schools, have to have a policy where they can identify signs of radicalization. Now, what does signs of radicalization mean? Now, we've got examples, like you mentioned, a 3-year-old who's been, directed to the channel program to be de-radicalized. How can a 3-year-old be radicalized? Remember, this is being pushed as though we're trying to stop people from engaging in violence. But the application of this, the explanation of this, is built upon a flawed narrative. So that's why you've got 3-year-olds. That's why you've got people like Mac Chistey. Mac Chistey is one of the senior police officers, Metropolitan Police officers. He talks about radicalization. Muslims who stop buying from Marks and Spencer's, boycotting that. Muslims who think celebrating Christmas is considered sinful. Muslims who start to dress Islamically when maybe they weren't dressing Islamically. Or that they think drinking alcohol is something which is prohibited in Islam. Now, when you've got somebody like who's a chief police officer or a prominent police officer,
outlines in a public speech.
That's right. He says this situation. Then you have situations where a boy in Hampstead, he was giving out boycott Israeli leaflets, and he was brought onto a channel program. So you can't express any political views almost like against Israel. Or you had a primary school in, I think it was Walthamstow area, where they were asked questions to work out whether people are radicalized or not, whether they believe it, that God has a purpose for them, or whether they think it's okay to marry outside of their religion. Now they're doing this as a mapping exercise to work out who are the radicals, who are not the radicals, what are, you know, the demographics within our own school or within our own community, and then they use this then to try and you know, take certain individuals, put them on supposedly de-radicalization programs. We've already had cases in Ladypool Road, which was in Birmingham, where they put spy cameras, which was under the prevent agenda, in order to look at people coming in and going out of that particular area within Birmingham. This is how it's being applied in reality, in actuality today.
Mohammed Amin, are you comfortable with all of these examples? And there'll be many more anecdotal examples. Are we comfortable with the kind of society that goes through this process?
Well, first of all, there was a very long list of examples, and I can't deal with all of them individually. But let me start with Machisty, because I know Machisty, and I read the article that's being referred to, and it's been regularly misunderstood and misquoted. What he was emphasizing was that if you get a sudden change in a person's behavior, right, if somebody starts behaving very differently to the way that they were behaving now, it could be a danger signal in terms of that person being radicalized.
Is that not a ridiculous statement to make on a public platform? For example,
no, it's a very sensible statement to make.
Somebody suddenly grows a beard, are they to be seen as now a potential non-violent extremist?
If somebody suddenly changes their level of religious practice, potentially it might be fine, potentially it might be a problem. It is something to be
thought. So we're starting from a
Adnan,
position of suspicion.
Yeah, this is the problem. The problem is that if a person becomes more Islamic, that's the perception that's being given. And that's the perception that's given to wider society. That's the danger. That if a person becomes more Islamic, they are a potential threat.
I will pick up exactly from here.
Upon.
And what you might need to ponder, or what we are going to consider, is whether the opposite change would also be reflected upon. But I've got a caller. I've got a sister from London. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. I'd like to put a question to Mr. Amin, if I may, please.
Yes, go ahead, sister.
I'm finding it very difficult to swallow what you're saying, Mr. Amin. At one point you're talking about that the Prime Minister did not mean certain things, but here in his speech he was very critical of two organizations who have been giving platforms for people to have their democratic say. One was CAGE and the other one MPAC. Help me to understand, why would you be so critical of those two organizations, and yet you talk about that we are actually allowed to say what we like, and that we will not be held back, and that we will not be criminalized?
Well, allow me to add on a little bit to that question. When the Prime Minister spoke at Meet the Press, before he made the speech, he said, for far too long we've been, accepting of these people who are just bubbling below the surface, as it were. And one of the things that he took issue with was some of the people who may think a caliphate would not be such a bad idea. So I'm going to thank my caller for her contribution, and we're going to pick up the conversation with her question and my addendum to it. That there is a genuine belief amongst many Muslims that a caliphate would genuinely not just not be a bad idea, but is an obligatory position in Islam. Why is that something that the Prime Minister feels that he can single out a religious belief held by millions across the world and say that is a sign of something we need to be wary of, something we need to watch out for?
Well, let's take the caller's question
as well as the organisations, yes.
Yep. Let's start with CAGE. I've met some of the CAGE people. I've watched a lot of television programs where one of the people from CAGE was saying what a nice young chap this guy, Jihadi John, used to be.
Before he became Jihadi John.
Yeah, and putting all of the blame for this guy becoming Jihadi John on our security services.
That's extremely unfair, because the quote was this. What he said was that he was a beautiful young boy when he was going through a lot of his troubles, and I had met him on a personal level before he became what he is now. And a significant degree of that change is because of the bullying and harassment that our security services levied upon him. Now, you don't have to agree with that view, but the fallout that followed, the indignation at how can you say that our security services, MI5, would behave in this manner? Well, it's well documented in evidence within that case, as far as Cage goes. How can you say that a person was a beautiful boy before they are not such a beautiful boy? How is that a ridiculous statement to make? It's selective quoting of an individual from something that he said the complete opposite. He didn't say that this person is a model individual. He said he used to be, when I knew him, he was a beautiful boy. It's tragic what has happened, and a significant part of the blame for what has happened, why he is no longer a beautiful boy, is because of the bullying and harassment. That was a fair analysis, even if we disagree with it.
And the Charity Commission has looked at Cage very closely and made it very clear that charities should not be giving money to fund Cage.
Again, second thing, the Charity Commission this week has been dragged into court, and where Cage's judicial review application has been allowed, where the Charity Commission overstepped its boundaries in giving advice to charities in interacting with Cage, who are not a charitable organisation. So our judiciary in this country have actually thought Cage's position was stronger than the Charity Commission's. Another one of the issues gone, but nobody's going to listen to this because all of the propaganda is already out there.
I haven't been following this case, but exactly I suspect that what you're telling me is that the judge has agreed that it's a triable issue rather than having found for Cage.
Oh, no, he hasn't found for Cage.
Yeah.
What he said is that they are allowed to pursue their judicial review of the Charity Commission's actions, and their judicial review is based upon the Charity Commission overstepped its boundaries. It was ultra-vires in its behaviour. I understand, no, it's
that's
not
Cage's argument. I'd like to see what the final judgment is.
I understand, that's fine. However, one of the basic things that they must have done and have to do is present at least a prima facie case. That there is at least a basic minimum case, which courtesy we've not afforded all of the people we extradite to America. So they would have had to meet a certain standard, and they've met that. The judge has allowed it. So again, that allegation is founded upon, as things currently stand, founded upon nothing, because the case here is actually against the Charities Commission and not against Cage. We have found nothing criminal, despite all the ostracization, nothing criminal about Cage or any of its individual directors. Mozambique was locked up for 9 or 10 months. Eventually they had to let him walk because the security services knew of his visit. He told them with his lawyer present. Can you see how Muslims feel victimized by a lot of what the government is doing, a lot of what the society does, a lot of what the media does? Can you genuinely not see that as a problem here?
I can see some organisations that have large chips on their shoulders. Coming back, the lady also asked about Impact UK.
Yes.
I've looked at the Impact UK website a few times in the past. I don't read it because I find its views totally reprehensible. Nobody's criminalising Impact UK.
And that is your right. However, when you speak on a public platform and you attack a certain group who are not a political rival of yours, you're not making a political speech as having a better solution for the NHS. You are specifically targeting a group. You ought to have a very good grounding for why you do it. Not just that you have a personal opinion that you don't find their views very, palatable, because you might have the same view about the Labour Party. And B, that is, when it comes from the highest power in the land, as it were, when it comes from the Prime Minister, those words carry weight. So it's not just a criticism made by, your average Joe blogs like myself. This is the Prime Minister of the country speaking. He's not allowed to just start naming organisations and, putting them on this public critique without good cause and good reason. So you don't find their website very readable, fine. However, you would still have to point to what it is that they've done to breach the law of this country.
No, David Cameron is not saying that they breached the law. He's saying that they are I don't have an exact quote for him, but from what you're telling me, I understand him to have said that they are a highly reprehensible organisation and not contributing to making our country better.
I think what he actually said was he criticised the NUS for supporting Cage. This is the problem. What he does...
The National Union of Students.
Any organisation which seems to support a Muslim organisation which runs counter to the narrative that the government is pushing, they are seen as a problem and as a threat. And that's a way that they are trying to isolate the Muslims from expressing any political or alternative voice within this country. That's why the Charities Commission tried to put pressure and bullied those charities that were giving money to the Cage and saying you couldn't do it, and in fact we'll effectively take you to court or take away your charitable status. from these organizations. So we're facing this type of situation. So what occurs then is that people like Cage are not allowed to go to universities. They are not allowed to be given, charitable money. They are not allowed to have a voice within the community, not because what they say is wrong, or because of what they say is criminal, or because of what they say incites other people to commit criminal acts, but simply because it contradicts the current government narrative. That's a problem.
I really need to try and move on to this last bit, because we've got 10 or 15 minutes left of the show. And this is the primary thing which was missing both from Cameron's speech and has been missing from our conversation tonight. What degree of delusion does a well-informed Prime Minister of a nation have to be in to believe or completely leave out the idea that both violent and non-violent extremism, whatever that is, are at least significantly contributed to, if not chiefly led by, the foreign policy blunders made by this country? Sharif.
Look, obviously he doesn't want to talk about foreign policy, he doesn't want to talk about domestic policy, and he doesn't want to talk about the role of security services, because as soon as you talk about these things, then you have to look at what are the actions that the government's done in order to create the environment that has resulted in some isolated individuals committing acts of violence. Because there's another thing, which is the over-exaggeration of the threat. You know, statistical analysis states that you're more likely, 10 times more likely to die from a lightning strike than you are from a terrorist act. The Europol data said that for the last 6 years, 99.4% of all terrorist actions were committed by non-Muslims, non-religious, throughout Europe, throughout the EU. This idea that somehow there's a big problem, one, and the second issue is that somehow it's internal to the Muslims, and it's internal to their understanding of Islam, which is the problem. And therefore, if a person dramatically becomes more Islamic, or creates that change, or starts speaking about criticizing the foreign policy or the domestic policy of the West, that he must be spied upon, or there must be suspicion placed upon him. All of these things are flawed. And many research, empirical research, has shown that it's, this idea that radicalization, then you've got terrorism, is a flawed myth.
It doesn't add up. Mohammed Amin, let me bring you in. Let's break that narrative down slightly. We've spoken of 7/7. You can bring in the murder of Lee Rigby. There'll be other foiled plots within Britain since the beginning of this millennium. The ideology, more often than not, is criticized as a medieval ideology. So this ideology stems from, or the people who believe in it believe that it stems from Islam. Stems from at least 13, 14 centuries ago. Muslims controlled vast swaths of land. Even many European nations, modern nations, were under Muslim control for centuries, for the best part of 13 centuries. Vast non-Muslim populations. Why is it that it took until 2005 for the British mainland to be attacked by Muslims who are purveyors of this ideology for the past 1400 years, if it isn't to do with foreign policy?
I fully accept that foreign policy is one of the reasons that terrorists give for what they do, and I take that at face value. So let's go to the 7/7 bombers, Mohammed Sadiq Khan, who left us his suicide video. He makes it quite clear that he's doing this because he is concerned about British foreign policy, he says, you're killing Muslims overseas, so I'm going to kill people here.
Michael Adebolajo.
But no, let me finish. There are also lots of other people equally anti-British foreign policy who don't kill people on the underground. The other thing about Mohammed Sadiq Khan, apart from...
Can I to name some?
Pardon? No, let me finish. Yeah. The other thing about Mohammed Sadiq Khan was that he clearly believed that what he was doing was a good thing. Absolutely. After his bomb went off, and on the Day of Judgment, I'm sure that he felt totally confident about how Allah was going to deal with him on the Day of Judgment. If he had believed that what he was doing was a major sin, he would not have carried out that suicide bombing. That is why the beliefs matter. That is why the beliefs are really important.
Absolutely. That's
fine. The problem is two things.
One little thing, if I may connect to it, and that will be my next point with yourself, and you can come in. When you say beliefs matter, I believe belief can be quite central. In fact, it is quite foundational. But what you have to then extend that to is to accept that the reason why, and you mentioned half the point where you said there are other people who are anti-British foreign policy, who don't go out and commit, these acts of murder. Those other people happen to be not Muslim.
No,
that's the connection you're making. However,
no.
killing,
There are plenty of Muslims who also were unhappy about British foreign policy, and they reacted to the Iraq War
Islam doesn't
by
allow
voting
us to do so.
by
However,
voting
what we
Liberal
accepting-
Democrat and things like that.
What we must accept is that when we go and kill Muslims, a small, tiny fraction of people who see them as part of their brotherhood, global brotherhood, may retaliate. That's surely the chief reason for some of the violent acts. But we'll come on to that, Sharif.
Yeah, no, I think this is the problem, which is that on the one hand, people are saying foreign policy is a problem, and on the other hand, people who non-violently resist that, non-violently challenge British or American or what they see as Western hegemony, control over them, the third world and other countries, when they challenge that, they are being told by David Cameron and they're being told by the government that you are people who are part of the problem, part of the extremism narrative. You are the radicalizers. Because if you start talking and criticizing British foreign policy, effectively you share the same ideas as these organizations or these individuals that might undertake actions, incorrect actions. And what does that result? That results in legitimate Islamic discourse being silenced because Muslims are going to be stigmatized with the term radical. They can't get jobs as GPs or as teachers, or they may be excluded at university, or they may be excluded from schools. This is the potential, this is where it's going down towards, because they are criticizing just verbally, like I mentioned the example of a student giving out a anti-Israeli boycott leaflet, and he was put on a channel program. So you're doing that. Then what happens is that isolated individuals who have the anger but don't have the knowledge of Islam, don't have the knowledge of how to, correctly in the Islamic way challenge this, therefore may undertake criminal actions and go beyond. So actually what the British government does is it's fueling the problem, isolating the voices. Just one example of
I do need to bring in the caller. I'll come back to you, Sharif. Yes, Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah. This is Qasim.
Yes.
Just 2 points. One point, quick point, is the Eliza Manningham, who's the ex-MI5 head of MI5. She said in a statement, it's well documented. You can Google it and find it on the internet. She said that, and she warned Tony Blair that if he went to war in Iraq, that she would, and in her words, radicalize a whole generation of people. Those are her words. So the war in Iraq has caused, a lot of grievances with people. People are grieved by that, and that's, as you mentioned, a number of people have quoted that as their grievance. The other point is that these people who, sorry, I don't know the gentleman who was arguing in favor of David Cameron, but these people who say that they're acting in the name of Islam, they have no knowledge about Islam, and I don't know how anybody can say that these people do have knowledge. They have no knowledge whatsoever about Islam, so you can't say that they're acting.
Well, Qasim, I am in the last few minutes of the show. Thank you very much. I've got your question. I will put it to the panel, but
so can I just make the point? There was a course that was done in one of the cities on Khilafah. One of the aims of this course was to dispel the myths and the propaganda that's being pushed by the government, by the media, which is demonizing something that many Muslims see as part of Islam. Imam Ghazali talks about how it's one of the branch aspects of the belief of a Muslim. And also it was there to challenge ISIS narrative. This idea that it is going to create sectarianism, it's instability, that it's through fighting that you establish it. So it's to challenge this, because we face within our community many people who are angry, who want to see change, but haven't got a clear understanding what Islam says about this. What happened with that course? It was done a year ago. A year later, a day after David Cameron's speech, it was in the Times newspaper as an example of radicalization. So what they're doing effectively is saying you can't, as a community, talk about certain aspects of Islam because we think that it goes into this narrative of radicalization, even though Muslims themselves believe that it's actually the cure to many of the problems and not part of the problem itself, which is different to what Cameron is saying.
Can we see a problem with this when you try and suppress voices in the public arena? Can you see how that lack of ventilation may then mean that you'll get either more people who will take to violent acts because they are not allowed to take peaceful means with it, or you are silencing people's views, which runs counter to the society's claimed values. Can you not see a problem with that?
We are not abolishing free speech. What we're making clear is that some people and some organizations that put forward views which effectively push people towards extremism and eventually violent extremism.
Like the Conservative Party, some might argue, for example, because many members of the Conservative Party left and joined UKIP, who many see as a far-right organisation. Can you see how this conveyor belt theory doesn't really weigh up? Being a member of a group or a party and moving on to different pastures doesn't mean that you were inspired. More often than not, it actually means you were disappointed with where you were before.
The people that we're talking about and the organisations that we're talking about are much more extreme than that. I'm not going to name names, partly because I don't want any lawsuits, and the government will, when it publishes its extremism bill, will have to define them in language that will stand up in court, that can be applied by judges, because it will need to be applied by judges. And I'm not going to try to come up with those definitions now. But the fact that there is a problem that people who are non-violent are still promoting extremism which leads to violent extremism, that is the most fundamental point.
But we can't finish on that. We have literally a matter of a minute and a half left. But that theory is well and truly debunked. There is no empirical evidence that suggests this conveyor belt theory of people moving from non-violent extremism to extremism. Surely the government would ditch a narrative once it's been shown in the public that it actually is quite laughable for academics, because it has no serious backing or any data behind it. It's just words being uttered by people who do not have evidence for it.
I don't agree with you.
Any evidence for it?
Well, first of all, the name conveyor belt theory itself is deliberately set up as an Aunt Sally, because it implies that everybody who gets on one end of the conveyor belt only moves in one direction until they fall off at the other end as a violent extremism. And that clearly is not the case.
That was the argument of Zeno Baran. That was the argument that was produced by the Nixon Center. It was a policy paper that was written in about 2005. That's where that term conveyor belt terrorism...
It is not a Muslim term.
It wasn't Muslims. It wasn't a straw man argument that Muslims... They came up with it. And the argument in that narrative exists now, which basically says that if you go on one end, if you have certain ideas, if you believe in Khilafah, Sharia, Islam is a way of life. If you believe that Muslims will actually live a better life in the Muslim world under Islam rather than secular dictatorships, then you are part of a problem and you need to be either marginalized, you need to have control orders placed upon you, your children may be taken away by social services, you may be excluded from universities.
I must at this juncture interject. I'm going to give you both gentlemen 15 to 20 seconds each as your final say on the subject. And the focus of the entire discussion, obviously, is very difficult to wrap up, but it's got to be, when we've had this discussion, do we feel at ease that a society which proclaims itself as free, it prides itself upon those values at least, and then goes out of its way to try and stamp on what is in essence thought, not actions, but thought, is that something that is, reflective of what the society claims?
My answer to you is the government does not have any kind of anti-Muslim agenda, that the policies that we're putting forward are policies that in the long run will help British Muslims.
Fantastic. Okay, Sharif, 10 seconds.
The problem is obviously when you say you're not anti-Muslim, but then you're criminalising discussions of Khilafah or Sharia, or you're stopping Muslims being able to express themselves, which they believe are actually solutions from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're not just any old ideas. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to us and that we should be able to express. That's the problem, and actually then it comes across as though the government's not really serious. It's about...
Sorry, I must sorry to cut you off.
No.
I must wind up there. The time for the show is up. It's a lengthy discussion. It's a lively discussion. It will continue to happen simply because we've got a bill that's going through Parliament right now. There's a paper that is being discussed, research that is being carried out by the government, and as that story develops, then we'll delve into it further. We've had a healthy discussion with two sides of the argument here. We've looked at David Cameron's outlining speech. I will bid you goodbye until next week. I've been Adnan Khan. I'm going to thank both my guests, Mohammed Amin from the Conservative Muslim Forum and Mohammed Sharif Hafizi from a Manchester speaker and writer. Thank you very much. I'll see you next week.